You could argue that scientists, after having displaced faith as a source of valid knowledge in our understanding, have now proceeded to place themselves in the position of God, demanding that we put our faith in them, a faith that was once only reserved for God.
Are you crazy? Is that your problem?
Hey everyone, JL here, and welcome back to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. I recently came across Brian Holdsworth, who is a theist content creator here on YouTube. Brian is a Catholic and describes himself as a communications professional and struggling thinker. His content examines a wide variety of societal and cultural trends and topics, all through the lens of the Catholic faith. Brian's presentation is calm and friendly, and he often addresses difficult topics with warmth and empathy. And his approachable demeanor is likely why he's on the verge of cracking 100,000 subscribers. However, after sitting through and dissecting his video entitled "Trust Science is a Bad Idea," I now think there is a valid argument for Brian Holdsworth being one of the more dangerous theist content creators that I've had the distinct displeasure of coming across. Now, this video is a little on the long side, and it gets pretty deep in some places, so I will not begrudge you if you don't stick around until the end. But if you would like a rare glimpse into what I think is some of the best representation as to why many theists today are so ignorant of, or seemingly impervious to, the scientific advances that many of us take as second nature, then stick around and be sure to buckle up, because this one just might aggravate you as much as it did me.
The apparent obligation to trust science has possibly never been more imposing than it has been recently. It's gone from a slogan in debate to a concept that can determine whether or not our fundamental rights are withheld from us or granted based on how well we adhere to it.
Statements like this are what really aggravate me when I listen to faith-minded individuals speak about science, especially those that use their computers, phones, internet, and cars on a daily basis without being experts in those technologies, because at its core, it's a complete mischaracterization of what science actually is. First and foremost, Brian, let me be very clear on this. There is no obligation to simply trust science, and there never was. That's not how science works. This notion of just trust the science is nothing more than a theist buzz phrase, typically used in response to two major points. One, the fact that scientists have precisely zero obligation to explain to the general public every single methodology behind every single one of their conclusions outside of their published documentation. And two, the fact that the vast majority of the general public has precisely zero interest in doing all the work necessary so that they can fully understand what is written in those published articles. Even though doing that very thing is included as a part of the scientific process when determining the truth of any given conclusion. Science is evidence-based, and scientific methodologies are extremely precise in the steps necessary to establish conclusions based on that evidence. This is why people who work professionally in these fields don't really concern themselves with the feelings of people who reject their conclusions, because they know that their conclusions are factually based on the available evidence, and that if the people questioning those conclusions were truly interested in understanding and the truth, instead of just being angry about a particular belief being refuted, that their processes can be replicated and their conclusions independently verified. It's this amazing thing that we call peer review, and it is vital to the methodology. However, to address your position, Brian, the belief in a god or gods is predicated on anecdote and faith, neither of which is sufficient in determining what is true about reality. So, Brian, what you are categorizing as a grand and impressive obligation to trust science is actually a growing cultural push for people to believe things based on demonstrable evidence and not faith. A cultural push that is a result of people being able to directly see the egregious harm that religious thinking can cause, thanks in part to the internet allowing people to see that harm in real time. Spouting trust the science, especially in debate, is just lazy and intellectually dishonest. And as far as our civil rights go, those rights apply to everyone in the society, regardless of their walk of life, not just one group, which means that what we establish as civil rights must be evidence-based and not faith-based. Primarily because, historically speaking, we've seen that faith-based rights create societal divisions and are ultimately disastrous. So, we base what rights are available to the populace on evidence because evidence applies to everyone equally. And it supports what is true regardless of one's personal feelings and beliefs.
But when people say trust science, how are we supposed to make sense of that? How are we supposed to understand that?
I agree with the sentiment that people should never just say trust the science, and for two reasons. One, it's completely arrogant, and through that arrogance, divides are created between those that readily understand the fields and those that don't, which in turn generates mistrust in those fields due to that poor representation. And two, it completely flies in the face of what the entire scientific process is intended to be, which is one of understanding reality through replication of process and elimination of bias, and certainly not in blindly trusting other people's anecdotal conclusions. Again, this is what peer review is for. So, as it has always been, the best way to understand science is to do the work yourself. So you too can personally see not just that the conclusions are true, but mechanistically speaking, understand how we know them to be true.
Because science means knowledge that we possess through our intellectual capacity.
No, Brian, and this is another egregious mischaracterization. Science is absolutely not the knowledge we possess. Science is a process that covers the entire systematic study of the physical and natural world through observation and experimentation. It is a process of understanding based entirely on an examination of available evidence and has built-in mechanisms that eliminate potential bias. It is, at its core, the deeply complex process by which we are able to determine the difference between what is real and what is imaginary. When you mischaracterize science as simply the knowledge we possess through our ability to learn, it legitimizes ignorant people challenging scientifically supported conclusions with what they feel to be true. And it's this kind of mischaracterization that does the greatest harm to our society. Because ultimately it fosters a distrust of education, a distrust of demonstrable reality, and justifies harmful societal divides. Thinking like this is precisely why flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, sovereign citizens, and dangerous religious extremists exist. Because it gives an air of validity to uneducated people's opinions against what can actually be verified to be true.
And because we possess it, and because it is within the grasp of our intellectual capability, there should be few, if any, unknowns about it.
Yet another mischaracterization. Science is not God, Brian. As many questions as the methodology answers, those answers will often lead to more questions. That is the heart of what science is, improved understanding through constant exploration. And sometimes we find those explanations quickly, sometimes not. And when you consider things like cosmic inflation theory, the halting problem, or the incompleteness theorem, there are even some explanations that we will never obtain. But anyone who frames science as something that presents itself as able to answer perfectly any question in existence is just dishonestly setting up science to fail and give validity to just coming up with your own answers based upon how you feel. Like, for a prime example, a god.
Yes, you believe everything you say is true, but it isn't. Your beliefs do not make something true. That is what we're doing here. Just because you claim to think something is true does not make it true. It does not protect you. It is not allowed.
As distinct from faith, which is laden with mystery, which is something that can make us uncomfortable a lot of the time.
That mysterious quality makes people feel uncomfortable because it is not an explanation for anything. Faith-based answers are not based on evidence. They are based on emotion. They are, by their very nature, biased, completely subjective to the individual. Thus, they have no credibility when it comes to describing an objective reality.
But in the modern age, or the age that we live in, science and technology have become so specialized and sophisticated that the average layperson like you and I have to admit that when we speak of scientific knowledge, we're not describing our own knowledge. It's not a knowledge that we personally possess. If it were our own knowledge, we wouldn't have to trust it the way that we do with faith. We would simply access it and live according to it.
It absolutely is if you've taken the time, applied yourself, and done the work. That way, it does become a part of your knowledge base, and you can readily access it at any time. And trust me, the work is hard. It takes serious application to understand many of these fields. Often it takes years, sometimes decades of study. And as dismissive as it may sound, if you refuse to apply yourself, if you refuse to do the work, then the responsibility for that is on you, not on those who dedicated their lives to understanding.
When someone says trust the science, what they really mean is trust my knowledge, which is superior to yours.
It's very easy for those who readily understand any particular field to fall into the trap of simply saying trust the science. Once a person has done the work and readily understands that field, it becomes rather easy to dismiss those who seem to have no interest in doing the work themselves. It's also easy to conclude that because it seems simple to you, then it should be simple to everyone else. And when you realize that not everyone does, and the vast majority refuse to do the work while simultaneously demanding explanations from you, it's even easier to take the arrogant position and simply say, trust me, bro. But just because there exists bad representations of science is not a reason to frame science as being a bad representation of understanding reality.
Trust me because I'm an authority, and therefore your skepticism, your questions, your concerns, your criticisms are inappropriate and invalid.
That's really only if they're an arrogant douche who is violating the very essence of what science is. Questions, criticisms, challenges, and a demand for clarification should always be welcome in science. But there must also be a willingness to do the work. In fact, science is dependent upon these things for that constant improvement in our understanding. The existence of bad actors does not change this.
Historically, the great hope of science was that it would liberate us from our limitations, especially those limitations that are imposed upon us by the natural world. We often resent those limitations, and so we sought to develop technology and knowledge that would help us transform the world around us according to our own desires and expectations.
I would somewhat agree with half of this, but I certainly wouldn't frame it as a result of resenting anything. Because when you use that term, Brian, you imply the existence of an agent in the universe whose actions humans would be resentful of. And given the evidence, that's profoundly intellectually dishonest. If anything, our basic scientific understanding of reality has its roots deep in our naturally evolved information-seeking behavior. Now, science was instrumental in helping humans overcome their natural weaknesses in the physical world, but science, ultimately, in its most poetic sense, is about achieving understanding. Because with an improved understanding of an environment comes better odds of surviving that environment. Certainly, the improvements in travel, healthcare, communications, and resource management have had drastically positive and negative effects on both us and the planet. But these were the consequences of that initial fundamental goal. Because if we didn't understand our world, then we wouldn't have been able to fully exploit it for our survival as we have done.
The famous communist philosopher Karl Marx once wrote that philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
Often in an attempt to maximize an appeal or anchor the audience to a particular emotional bias, theist content creators will often drop quotes from historical figures absent their context. And I've since learned the necessity of double-checking any given quote for that context. Especially during this current Western societal trend of conservative Christians demonizing the name Karl Marx, and the socioeconomic analysis that is his namesake, while possessing little understanding of either. So bear with me here, because to get the full context of this quote, we're gonna have to dig a little deep into history. Marx penned these words as a set of notes for a work that he would later co-author with Friedrich Engels called The German Ideology. Part of that work was Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, which was in regards to fellow German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. Now, in the wake of philosopher George Hegel's death and the ambiguity of his legacy, there developed two factions of Hegelianism. The old Hegelians, or Hegelian right, who interpreted and took Hegel's work in a more politically and religiously conservative direction, and the young Hegelians, or Hegelian left, who interpreted Hegel's philosophy as supporting left-wing and progressive politics and religion. Ludwig Feuerbach was a member of the young Hegelians, as was Karl Marx. However, Marx eventually broke away from the group, dissatisfied with what he saw as a soft intellectual trend regarding the societal perils of Christianity's continued existence. The quote here was penned in regard to Marx's view that true change could only come about if human practices were changed. He held that Hegelian philosophers separate thinking from activity, and that once philosophy is removed from practical action, then it no longer represents anything real. In Marx's mind, the young Hegelians had missed the point, and that was to use those philosophical interpretations to effect change in the world. So now that we know the full context of this particular quote, let's see how Brian uses it.
In other words, we used to use science and technology to understand the nature of things and then to try to conform ourselves to those laws.
Well, first off, Brian, it's good to hear you finally acknowledge how science is about understanding, despite how that directly contradicts what you initially said about science being a result of humans resenting their perceived weaknesses, which I see now makes this statement about the fundamental understanding that science strives for into a throwaway observation. And we humans don't conform ourselves to the laws that we discover. The laws that we discover help us to understand our strengths and our limitations in regards to what is real. And that understanding leads us to creative ways to overcome those limitations so that we can turn them into strengths and achieve even more understanding. Like bumpers on a bowling alley, they keep us out of the gutters and firmly in the lane of progress.
But according to Marx, it is the natural world who should genuflect to us through science and technology, which makes me think, what could go wrong with that?
That is absolutely incorrect. Marx himself didn't really have a philosophy of nature, because he didn't really see nature as something separate from society. Marx held that humankind's relationship with nature was closely interwoven when it was not distorted by capitalism. In Marx's own words, nature is man's inorganic body. That is to say, nature insofar as it is not the human body. Man lives from nature, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. This view of the vital importance of nature in regards to humanity itself, and the truth that science could glean from it, were paramount to Marx's philosophy. Capitalism was an affront to Marx because he saw the untethered exploitation of resources for personal gain, and the short-sightedness of the social warfare it results in as ultimately self-defeating. And Christianity was an affront to Marx because he saw the religion as directly antagonistic towards science, something he believed was absolutely necessary for the discovery of truth. By framing Marx in this particular light, Brian, you've set the stage for your own dishonest demonization of the man.
And what did we get for those great hopes and expectations? We went from being subject to the laws of nature to the great conquest of nature by science, such that now only a few select scientists can wield the knowledge and technology that is so sophisticated most of us don't understand it.
This end result of the vast majority of people not understanding science is not the fault of science in and of itself. There are many socioeconomic and sociopolitical factors at play regarding access to higher education. Yes, there is a small percentage of the human population that is working professionally in any specific scientific field. But the same is true of any specialized field, and the more specialized it gets, the smaller the percentage. But your lack of understanding of any particular field is not because the science is being withheld from you by some grand cabal of nefarious scientists. It's simply because you haven't done the work yourself. If you want to know, get up, get out there, and learn. The whole of human knowledge is literally at your fingertips. Inaccessibility is no longer an excuse. And what you're interpreting as the conquest of nature is nothing more than casting a poetically negative light on exploration. When it comes to the laws of nature, there is no conquering them. There is only understanding them and their applications. We can't conquer the laws of thermodynamics any more than we could conquer a metaphysical concept. Your persistent conflation of conquering and exploration is concerning, Brian, because it makes one wonder what you're subtly yet dishonestly attempting to anchor the audience to.
The conquest of nature by science actually turns out to be the conquest of scientists over the world of their fellow man.
That would be true if the entire realm of science was being withheld from the masses by a select few. But that is demonstrably not the case, Brian. Yes, the nation we live in at this time seems to value material success over education and knowledge. But for you to conflate a particularly high learning curve or a general lack of interest in the scientists with some concerted effort by scientists to rule over mankind is just grossly absurd.
We went from being subjects to the laws of nature to being subject to those in lab coats. And for every problem that scientists solve, they seem to create a whole host of unintended new problems.
With this level of intellectual dishonesty and gross mischaracterization, it is no wonder why the vast majority of theists that I encounter and debate with are so woefully ignorant of the fields in question. All you've done here, Brian, is manage to give ignorant individuals a justification for rejecting scientifically demonstrated truths by painting the authorities in any given field as some sort of nefarious cabal looking to lord over humanity, like some sort of neo-Gnostic pantheon of knowledge hoarders. Seriously, Brian, what the hell is wrong with you? Do you not see the danger inherent in what you're doing here?
Industrialization made the world smaller and more accessible through new manufacturing methods and the harnessing of affordable and accessible energy, but now we are dependent on those energy sources, and we're told that they are disrupting our climate. Modern medicine was supposed to cure our ailments, and it has made great strides in doing so, but scientists have also used it to create super viruses in labs, which they sometimes can't control. Plastic was supposed to simplify our material needs, and now we have a floating island of plastic garbage in the Pacific Ocean.
Yes, there are consequences to our actions, but to put it very simply, you cannot make an omelet without breaking some eggs. The point is to learn from the consequences of our actions so that we can mitigate and eliminate potential consequences in the future. We know now that rampant industrialization and fossil fuel use is not sustainable, so we need to find and develop more sustainable methods of energy production, which we are currently doing. We know that while gain-of-function research can lead to vaccine breakthroughs, it's also dangerous because it can lead to more dangerous organisms. And yes, plastic revolutionized the world because we thought its cost-effectiveness outweighed its potential risks, and we are paying for it now. But what you fail to point out, Brian, is that each of these advancements and the consequences that followed are not the fault of science itself. They are the fault of humans either misusing, misunderstanding, or simply not caring about the consequences of the advancements. Science provides understanding, and with that will likely always be individuals who will attempt to capitalize on that understanding for personal gain. And while all of these are important topics, unfortunately, in the context of this video, Brian, all of them are completely irrelevant appeals to emotion.
And the reason that all of these unintended consequences keep erupting is because there used to be this harmony between philosophy of ethics and metaphysics and the philosophy that led to something like the natural sciences.
The negative consequences of our actions may have been unintentional, but they happened, and they happened for the reasons that I stated previously. Misuse, misunderstanding, or just plain greed. We learn from them, and we work to correct them. But moral philosophy and metaphysics are purely subjective to the individual, and the philosophy of science is concerned with understanding what is true about reality. There was never a harmony between them, there was merely the illusion of harmony created by a lack of understanding. In fact, the aforementioned philosophies are so subjective that one could make the argument that because humans possess the ability to understand things to the degree that we can, then we have a moral imperative to use that ability to do whatever it takes to ensure the survival of our species regardless of the cost to anything else. But all of this is nothing more than another appeal to emotion intent on framing scientists as immoral or amoral monsters. And it's a load of dishonest crap.
But at some point in the progression of Western civilization and the natural sciences and our intellectual inquiry, we discarded the ethics and the metaphysical side of our philosophy and our science, such that now when questions like, just because I can do something, does that mean I should do it, are really difficult to answer, and frankly, scientists don't even bother to answer it.
Incorrect. Many scientists do ask that question, and the importance of that question varies depending upon the field. As much as you may want to assume the role of Ian Malcolm here, Brian, you've actually missed the entire point of that scene from Jurassic Park. Ian Malcolm was Michael Crichton's Marxist. heavily criticizing Hammond's capitalistic spared-no-expense endeavor as ultimately illusory and powerless in the face of nature. To Ian Malcolm, scientific advancement was necessary for truth, but not when it comes at the expense of the very nature that we are reliant upon to survive. He saw that an abuse and sacrifice of that which we need to survive was not only bad science, but it was nihilistic to the point of self-destruction. Like so many other theists, Brian, you are mischaracterizing Marx based solely upon his utter disdain for Christianity. And in your lack of understanding, you have unwittingly assumed the role of Marx in pointing out the dire consequences of the capitalization of science. However, none of this is relevant because the existence of those that capitalize on science does not demonize all of science. It just points out that it's up to all of us to do better when it comes to the advancements we make.
Trust is something that should be earned, and in the case of God, that's always the pattern that he seems to follow with us. God always starts with a demonstration of who he is and what he's capable of doing.
Begging the question assumes the existence of such an entity to demonstrate anything to us. And you're also dishonestly conflating trust with faith here, Brian. Trust is evidence-based. Faith is emotion-based. As much as you wish they were, they are not synonymous. At this point, I'm going to jump ahead because the next minute of this video is just Brian preaching. It's all just a bunch of unsubstantiated and unsupported claims about God and the Bible that are completely irrelevant to the topic at hand.
In the case of the natural sciences and scientists, is that kind of trust and devotion really appropriate?
To an extent, yes. But as I stated before, any of these fields are open to anyone who wants to get into them. If they are legitimately concerned about the consequences of the advancements we're making, then they should dive in, get educated, and start making a difference. The only thing stopping them is their level of interest and their work ethic. It's entirely up to the individual.
Certainly natural science has made massive contributions to humanity, but does it or the people who wield it really deserve our unquestioning obedience?
Obedience? No, and they don't expect it either. Scientists, for the most part, and depending upon the field, don't really care about people's personal beliefs. That's not their job. You can either make an effort to understand the science or not. Whether you do or don't is not their concern. Truth is that which comports with reality, and just because some people refuse to accept that doesn't make it any less true. But if you're not willing to pick up a slide rule, a microscope, or a stethoscope and get involved, then you really have no business questioning or complaining. A prime example of this is me making this video. Instead of just sitting back and allowing through my inaction a mockery to be made of steep philosophical concepts and scientific advancements in an effort to deceive and manipulate people, I sought to get educated on these concepts so that I could do my part in ensuring that people are not taken in by charlatans and grifters, especially ones who present themselves as educated when they are anything but.
Well, in trying to answer that question, consider that a recent study out of the University of Oxford concluded that 94% of medication, and therefore the treatments that are used in clinics like the one that you and I go to, are not supported by the evidence. That was 94%, in case you missed that number.
Once again, Brian, you are making an emotional appeal, citing the corruption of science by capitalistic endeavors. Take the capitalism out of it and you'll likely solve most of those problems. You're literally making Marx's argument, but instead of owning it, you're just pointing out the consequences of corrupted science and then committing the fallacy of composition by lumping all of science and scientists into that one category.
And can you think of any reason why a select minority of people in possession of a unique knowledge and technology and power would use it to their advantage at the expense of the rest of us? Because I can think of a lot of reasons.
Yeah, it's called unfettered, unregulated capitalism.
And according to a now well-respected and much discussed paper by John Ioannidis called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, he concludes that 90% of research that is published in medical journals, which is the threshold that we're supposed to observe to establish what is proven science, he says that 94% of it is just wrong and junk science.
And the wanton deception continues. Yes, Brian, you are correct that Professor John Ioannidis wrote an essay titled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. After the essay was published, there were, of course, criticisms of some of its more extreme claims. And the peer review by biostatisticians Lee Yeager and Jeffrey Leake at Johns Hopkins revealed that in replicating Ioannidis' work, false positive rates were actually around 14%, not the 50% that Ioannidis had initially asserted. Nonetheless, Ioannidis' broader arguments and warnings have been largely accepted by the scientific community, and this has resulted in even stricter qualifications for evidence and reporting the results of research. So Ioannidis actually reshaped the field of research and reporting findings, and science has benefited from that ever since. And you conveniently left out, Brian, when Ioannidis wrote that report, which was in 2005, the subsequent peer review of his findings, and most importantly, the positive effects of what he brought to the scientific community over the past 17 years. And honestly, Brian, you leaving out that information is a level of intellectual dishonesty that borders somewhere between gross incompetence and blatant deception.
But yet this is the very same system and discipline and people that we are supposed to devote ourselves to through slogans like "Trust the Science."
Given the level of abject dishonesty, mischaracterization, and fallacious appeals I've seen demonstrated here, that's not at all surprising.
So it seems to me that we find ourselves back where we started from in our attempts to be liberated by the shortcomings of faith and religion, or at least the parts that made us uncomfortable. But now, instead of putting all of our trust in a higher authority, like God or one of his messengers,
still assumes they exist. Please provide evidence to support your claim.
We have to place an undue amount of faith and trust in our fellow human beings, the scientists.
For the last time, Brian, we place trust and confidence in them, not faith. I trust in scientific methodology, and I have confidence that it can reveal what is true to me about reality and explain it to me in a way that I can understand it. You place faith in things because there is no evidence to support that they even exist. Remember, Brian, no matter how much you conflate the two because it helps your argument, faith and confidence are not synonymous.
Who we are supposed to be equal to, but because of the dynamics of the power that they have been given through their unique training, I would say that it's far from an equal dynamic.
Then get yourself educated on these topics, Brian. Then you won't feel so left out, and you won't be creating any more ignorant people who will be running around posing a threat to themselves and to the general public at large. Now, from this point forward, Brian arrogantly posits that scientists just want to replace God, even though he doesn't demonstrate that it actually exists, and then he continues to misrepresent science, putting the failure of people to understand science on science itself, instead of on the people who make no effort or hold no interest in understanding it. Obviously, this one aggravated me quite a bit, and the more I dismantled it, the more aggravated I became. I find it infuriating that some theists are so terrified of their belief system being debunked that they will resort to predatory deception just to salvage that belief system. But I will also acknowledge that I came away from this video with a better understanding of why so many of the theists that I interact with lack even a fundamental understanding of the most basic scientific concepts. Holdsworth's video is of course direct evidence of a concerted effort to mischaracterize and misrepresent scientific understandings and their advancements, as well as philosophy itself, in order to justify people holding on to their faith-based ideologies. And I, for one, think that warrants approaching these topics with theists with a bit more compassion, a bit more humility, and a whole lot of patience. While we can't do the work for them, we can afford them the understanding that they have been lied to by the people that they trusted most not to do so. And in that patience, help them to understand that they are not the problem, but yet another victim left indoctrinated, manipulated, and deceived in the wake of religion's ongoing war to remain relevant. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these efforts is in the description below. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 4th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, nab yourself some official Bridge the Divide swag, support the podcast, or even vote for me in the Face of Horror contest is down in the description below. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support. And as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.